Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and by other public television stations.
Our guest today was a spy in America for the Soviet Union. Her husband, who died a few years ago, once occupied a prison cell with two other anti-Tsarists. One of them, Svetlov, gave the order a few years later to execute the Tsar, the Tsarina, their daughters and son. The other prisoner was Joseph Stalin. When our guest's husband was dispatched to set up shop in the Far East, he recruited a man called Richard Sorge, the most notorious spy of World War II. It was he who informed Stalin of the exact day when Adolf Hitler would launch the war to the east in 1941. Shortly before the war's end, Sorge was caught and hanged. While in America, one of Mrs. Ulanovskaia's agents was Whittaker Chambers. During the war, the Ulanovskis were called back to Moscow. There, Nadia did translation work and came to know a number of American journalists, including C.L. Sulzberger, Walter Kerr, Larry LeSueur, Drew Middleton. Unhappily, she also came to know the Australian journalist Godfrey Blunden, to whom she confided her progressive disenchantment with the world created by her husband's former jailmate, Joseph Stalin. Blunden wrote a novel called A Room on the Route, based in substantial part on the disguised experiences of Nadia Ulanovskaia. But that didn't fool the KGB. Mrs. Ulanovskaia was arrested, kept in solitary confinement at the Lubyanka for a year, then sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in concentration camps in various parts of the Gulag Empire. Her husband wrote a personal plea to Joseph Stalin, in return for which he was picked up and sentenced to 10 years in a work camp. Their daughter Maya, then 15 years old, was arrested 2 years later for associating with dissident students, and she was sentenced at age 18 to 25 years in Siberian labor camps. Many years later, they were let out of concentration camps after Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin, and in the little reconstituted apartment in Moscow, Solzhenitsyn would visit with them. Nadia devoted herself to translating books like Robert Conquest's The Great Terror, Kessler's Darkness at Noon. Yevtushenko read it there. Daniel, now in jail, was their friend, and Sinyavsky and Bukovsky. The high point of their social season was always March the 5th, when they and their friends would drink a glass of vodka in celebration of the day that Stalin died. At the prodding of her grandson, Mrs. Ulanovskaia, now widowed, and her daughter and son-in-law moved to Israel. There she is working on her memoirs. She has come to London to participate in this program. I should like to begin by asking Mrs. Ulanovskaia whether she is familiar with the Hiss-Chambers controversy in the United States.
Yes, very well, I think. I read his book, The Witness, and some other things, some articles, since I've been out of Russia. I follow everything that appears on that case.
You left the United States in what year?
It was 1934, or the end of 1933. I can't remember exactly.
Which was before Whittaker Chambers met Alger Hiss.
Oh yes.
So therefore, you had no direct knowledge of Alger Hiss when you were in the espionage apparatus in America.
None at all.
How long did you know Whittaker Chambers?
We knew him in 1931 till the end of we met well, till we left.
For 2 years, approximately.
Yes, at least 2 years.
What
2 or
was
2
what
years.
was the nature of your activities during that period?
Well, you know, my husband was what they called resident, and my role was really very unimportant. I was just doing technical work there. And the nature of it in general, I mean, what I know about they were more interested in technical. You see the word spionage sounds a bit to me. We did.
Well,
I mean,
whatever the word is for stealing other countries' documents.
Yes, I suppose it is.
That was certainly the assignment, wasn't it?
Yes, they were mostly interested in technical. I remember my role was, well, I photographed them. By the way, Whitaker Chambers.
You mean you photographed the material that Chambers brought to you?
Not only Chambers, well, just materials that were brought to us.
You knew Chambers as what?
I met Chambers as soon as he was assigned to
But you didn't know
the
his
party.
name. You didn't know his name, did you?
Well, we were not supposed to know each other's names, but I happened to know him because he was a bit unusual.
In what sense?
In what sense? He was more intelligent, more intelligent than ordinary
Spy.
people. Communists that the Communist Party sent to us for that work.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, my husband said before I met him, he told me about a new man, and he said it was a waste on the part of the party to send him for that kind of work, a waste, because he was more intelligent, and he was at that time. He edited an editor of New Masses. New Masses, that was a communist publication, which I had read before, and he said he could be more useful in some other capacity, whereas we don't need such intelligent men for that kind of work that he was.
It's interesting. I once asked him how could he account for the Soviet machine taking him from a position in which he exercised such considerable influence and making him sort of a messenger boy, to which his reply was that I clearly didn't understand the workings of the Soviet mind. Does that mean that you don't understand the workings of the Soviet mind either? Since you're so surprised that they gave him that assignment.
But that was the American Communist Party. It was the Soviets had nothing to do with it. I mean, the Soviets wanted just people for that kind of work.
Yes, but
and
he was a subordinate of your husband, wasn't he?
Yes, but we got him from the party. He was assigned for that work, and we couldn't do anything about it. We just had to take the men that the party sent us. That was up to the Communist Party. I mean, that's.
So during that period, you and your husband were amassing information of any kind that might prove useful in Moscow.
Yes.
And you say you concentrated on technical information?
Yes, I remember all kinds of plans about Sikorsky and Seversky, something of that. I remember those names from that time.
Well, one was a helicopter man, and the other one was a great the polemicist force.
Endless,
air power.
Photographs and other kinds. I don't remember very much, but that's what we were doing. Only once they were mixed up in some really military things, and which my husband said, well, we were not really interested in that. The Japanese might be something about the Panama Canal. That was all, the only military.
You didn't, by any chance, photograph any secret plans by the New Deal on how to get out of the Depression, did you?
Economic, we didn't photograph, we just sent lots of material to the, all, trunks of economic
Material.
material
What,
that were published.
how did you send it? Through diplomatic sources?
Oh, no. First, there was no diplomatic relations.
There wasn't 33?
No diplomatic relations. The only Soviet organization was the Amtor. That was all. And we didn't use it. We sent we sent to Germany, through Germany mostly, on boats.
How many Americans did you come into contact with who were part of the apparatus?
Not many. Well, most of, all of those that Whitaker mentions in his book, I found all the familiar names, all the names that I knew. And
you knew most of those?
Yes, and I knew what happened to some of them afterwards when they came to Russia. They all perished in the purges.
Was there anything in Whitaker Chambers' book that was inaccurate insofar as you had personal knowledge of the events?
You mean in his book?
Yes.
Some dates, no, very minor mistakes, minor errors. That, well, maybe my memory is not so good, but in general, he gives a quite clear picture and a very accurate picture of that.
And did you have the impression from those 2 years in Washington and New York that there was very considerable sympathy for the Soviet Union among American intellectuals?
Oh, yes, more than that. Among the American intellectuals, well, there was universal sympathy. And, well, that's all I can say. My husband once said that there wasn't, we could have anyone. I mean, they were, well, maybe that's an overstatement, because, I mean, not every one of them would really join, I mean, join the
would have consented
organization,
to act
but he would do anything. As a matter of fact, I remember one case when my husband told me that. I never met that lady, but he met her, and he thought he could approach her, suggested to recruit her for our organization. She refused. She said she will do anything out of sympathy to the Soviet Union, but she wouldn't consider that to be really paid, member. So she refused.
I see. Well, now, what was it that caused you and your husband to leave the United States?
Nothing at all. I mean, that was the assignment. Usually, they were usually for 2 years, 2, 3, no more than that. So it was just time.
It was just simply a time to move.
Yeah.
It wasn't
so
that
no.
anybody was on to you or anything.
No. No, it wasn't that.
Now
because sometimes they have they had other plans, some other place where they wanted to send, so they recalled, but in general it didn't last longer than at that time. It was the usual term.
Now, you then went where after you left the States?
After we left the States, we went to Moscow, and I didn't live. They had an assignment for my husband, and my husband went by himself. I had a small child, and I had another. Well, I decided to stay in Moscow to finish with all that. I didn't want to leave anymore.
Was your husband at that point, or had he been at all since 1917 in any personal touch with Stalin?
Oh no, never,
No.
never. When he came back when we returned from the States, he had some, some things that he didn't agree with, some in his experience that he thought should be changed. And then he met a friend of his who had been also with him and with Stalin at the same camp, at the same place of exile where they were. And when he told that to him, that man was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and he was in touch with Stalin. And when he heard all that, he said to my husband that, you know, there is only one man that can change, can do something to change things. Nobody else can. Do you want me to arrange a meeting with Stalin? And my husband said yes, but it didn't come off. So he never met him anymore.
I see.
He met Sverdlov after
17.
After 17. He met him but Sverdlov died very early. And
Yes.
so, but Stalin he never met afterwards. He was never close, never friendly with him, because Stalin lived, they met only occasionally. He lived in another place, but with Sverdlov. And then there were not very good relations between Sverdlov and Stalin. And my husband was very close with Sverdlov, and that's why.
So you stayed in Moscow throughout the 30s after you returned from the States?
Yes.
And at what point were you beginning to experience doubts about the Soviet system?
Well, you see, it's inaccurate. I was never formally a member of the party, just as my husband. So from the very beginning, we were a little, well, there was no party discipline, though sometimes I was more, you know, as they say, more royal than the
king, yes.
Yes. But when we were in the States, you know, it was the first time when, not that I began to doubt, but I just felt that, I felt that it was some reason we couldn't do what the capitalists achieved, that we are so far from them. And then it was the first country that seemed to me a democratic country. Before that, we had been in Germany, and we saw, well, it was clear to us, the capitalist bourgeoisie lived well and had all the privileges and all that, and you know, it was and there was nothing, didn't surprise us, you know, that was as it should be. But in the States, in spite of the terrible time of the Depression, which we read so much and we knew so much, but to us it didn't look terrible at all.
By contrast with what you had experienced.
Russia, with the Soviet Union, we saw the jobless people who still ate better, and well, they could. Things in the Soviet Union were at that time so terrible, that it didn't, you know, they once showed us the slums, of just some communist sympathizers.
Yes.
Well, says, I'll take you to the slums and you'll see. But the slums didn't impress me at all, because the way...
Made you feel at home?
Not, well, the way we personally lived in Moscow at that time was worse than the, you know, so it didn't impress us very much. And I began, my husband was a little skeptical all the time. But real doubts, no. But still, I came back to Soviet Union. I decided to stay there and work like any other Soviet citizen. I mean, all the deprivations and everything. I wanted to work for socialism, for world revolution and so on.
In whatever capacity?
Yes.
Now, when the
but
war...
in 1937, that's the great purges that jolted me out of all that. You know, that made me think and made me look and made and even listen to people. You see, we had missed the terrible time, the collectivization, and we didn't know anything about it. When we came back, some people, some of our friends tried to tell us something about it, but we didn't believe. Well, somehow we didn't listen to them.
Yes.
But
the 1937 purges you witnessed.
Then witnessed, and I said we started to look back, you know, and that was the end of our.
Was your husband's disillusionment coincidental with your own?
Yes.
Or was he in the Far East at the time?
No. He after his assignment in Denmark, where he got in trouble, and he returned in 1937 during the trials, Zinoviev-Kamenev trials.
Yes.
And you know, after Kirov's death, when the arrests started very widespread, and some of our acquaintances got arrested. So that was, he returned at that time, and that made us think. The trials, we believed the confessions and everything, and we were very indignant against Kamenev and Zinoviev for being such enemies of the people and resorting to such means in the struggle with the party line.
When did you discover that those confessions were synthetic?
Oh, next trial we were already sure that it was all nonsense, because that was 1937. But at that time, my husband said to me, we were discussing that, and we were terribly distressed about the whole thing. And he said, and I said to him, well, how could they? Well, they should be shot. It would be a slap in the face to Soviet people if they are pardoned, you know. And my husband said to me, well, it's not that simple. The fact that those people had to resort to such means shows that it's something is wrong in the whole structure. Why should they? And that was the first. And the next trials we had no doubts that it couldn't be, and that was all nonsense, that all those confessions and all that. And when they started, but still, when they started to take people that we personally knew them very well, and we always, we had good friends, and we were good friends, and we knew them, and we could say, well, and we had no doubts that
they were framed.
Yes, but the question was why? Mm-hmm. What's the purpose?
What was the purpose?
And that question was troubled us all those years before the war. That was the thing that we, why? What's the sense? What is it? Why should they kill off their own cadres? We knew the people that they had been arrested, that they were the most loyal Bolsheviks, so why should it be? Why?
Well, now, when you committed the grave, tragic error of communicating these reservations to Mr. Blunden, what was it that you told him?
Oh, well, that's exactly what I'm telling you. By the way,
these reservations.
Yes, you see, Blunden, I felt I could talk to him. Well, I could talk. Because his background was his father had been a socialist, one of the organizers of the Australian Social Democrats, you know, and so on. He knew that he was interested in that very much, interested in that great experiment, because he was not capitalist. He sympathized, and I felt at that time that there shouldn't, that's something that was our terrible tragedy, that the whole world was still looking at that country as, well, that great experiment I'm sorry, words just escape me.
No,
well, that will save humanity, you know, the human race, that the only hope of the human race, whereas at that time we were already convinced that the greatest catastrophe that happened in the world was the October Revolution. You know, we were always trying to find at what point that mistake was made, when did it turn wrong?
And you were back to October.
Back until, I remember that that day when we were still discussing, and I said, well...
You were 14 years old.
Oh, no, why? That was 1937.
Oh, I thought you said you were going back to the October Revolution.
Going in our discussions,
oh, I see.
When did it happen? When did it go wrong? You know, the revolution. And then almost simultaneously we said, well, first we said, well, during the collectivization. If Lenin had been alive, NEP would have been NEP, you know, the new economic policy.
Yes.
Would have lasted longer, and then it would. And then that mistake was made during the forcible collectivization
Of the kulaks, yeah.
And so on and so on. Well, if it weren't for that, if it were that, but then almost simultaneously we said, well, no, the greatest. When it happened in 1917, in October, old style, that was the October Revolution. That was the greatest mistake.
Well, projecting that forward, in the light of the fact that you were let out of the labor camp by Khrushchev,
yes,
is it fair to say that life in the Soviet Union has become much more pleasant?
Oh, there's absolutely no, it's quite different from what it was. It's a different quality. You say altogether different. At that time, you see, we couldn't communicate our thoughts to our closest friends.
Yes.
By the way, we met, also Bukov, the man whom...
Bukovsky?
No.
Oh.
At that time, before the war. That was his chief, Victor Chambers. His last one.
Yes.
We had known him before. Well, I knew him from 19, you know. As a young boy, I knew that man. We never liked him, but he considered. But we had been acquainted for so many years, and he looked up to my husband. Was, at the time when he got acquainted with him, that was about around 1919 or 1920. And when we met him in 1930, it was 1938. And of course we discussed those purges. And when and we were afraid, we just discussed, we were afraid to talk to him.
To exchange confidences.
Oh yes, absolutely. But just a little bit we tried, you know, we always tried to see what does he think about it. Of course he knew that the people that had been arrested or were not, as soon as we started a little bit further, how could it happen? It's only that regime, that's the kind of regime that can result in such things. As soon as we got to that point, everything was closed. And we were afraid to meet him again. And we never met again.
Well, now, you say that things are incomparably improved now.
Oh, yes. Now you can talk to your friends. And
well,
we do. We have a circle, and even more than that.
You can talk to your friends, but the night after Buckley last talked to you, he was taken off and sent to an insane asylum.
Oh, yes,
So
of
there are
course.
certain
And Grigorian,
consequences.
oh, yes, of course, but that's within reason. He's done something. And but at that time, people, you know, when I was in camp, we had plenty of time to discuss things, and once we were discussing what will be the end of it. Well, what's going to happen to us? We knew, our generation. Well, there was some wild things. Some people thought, well, there will be a war. Americans will come. Americans will
Liberate us.
Yes, and I knew all that was nonsense, and I didn't. And then they said, so what? I said, the only thing we can hope for is the liberalization of gradual liberalization of the regime. Not in our time, of course, because as long as Stalin is alive, there's no hope. But even for us, maybe, Stalin, there may come a time when if we don't do anything, and if we don't say anything against the regime, we may be reasonably sure that we will die in our beds and not be. Of course, says, well, is that all the prospect? I said, that's the prospect. And it's not such a bad prospect if it happens in our time. That means if Stalin dies before we die.
Well, yeah, I understand.
And now you can do something if you are willing to take a risk of losing your job. And to us, imagine at 18, my daughter got a sentence of 25 years for doing, well, Bukowski's activities in comparison with hers is, they didn't do anything. They didn't even think of any appealing to the West or something. And Bukowski got only, what was it, 7 and 5, and to us it's child's play. If you are willing to take a risk, you can fight against it. But at our time, it was absolutely
excluded.
Excluded. You would die like a rat in a hole, and that was all.
Well, what is your comment on those students of the Soviet system who tell you that there was a thaw in the a relaxation in the late 50s, but that in the last 5 or 6 years, the system has tightened up considerably? Is that your experience?
No, I don't think so. I personally don't think so. On the contrary, I think they can't help it. You know, when of course, at the time when Khrushchev, after the 20th Congress with Khrushchev, when he liberated us, and we were, well, it was spring of of our life. I mean,
Yes, of
we were
course.
all very happy. But a few months later, an acquaintance of ours, not a very close friend, was arrested again and sent for another 10 years for, she had written a book and she read it, and some of her friends, she let them read it. And she was denounced and she got another sentence, whereas now these books, you know, they circulate and people are still, like Ginsburg, she wasn't even expelled from the party. Ginsburg, you know, that book about, and her book, and that book of that woman, and so on. No, I find it, I don't agree that there's, well, maybe little recent. They say now, we hear of arrests now, well, lately, people that we know, but people that are active, they are doing something. You know, they're in that committee of monitoring the Helsinki
Yes,
Agreement. So, well, but just, you know, I don't agree. And I think
Your point, if I understand you, is that nowadays you can, for instance, read, if you can get hold of it,
if you
a foreign book that's anti-Soviet, as long as you don't agitate.
as for myself, always I was of that opinion. I think I was right that as long as I don't go out to the Red Square, you know, like demonstrate for, like our friends who did demonstrate for the against the invasion of Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
I was safe. They would never, well, especially because of my age and because of, they wouldn't do. And I acted accordingly. I met foreigners. I wasn't afraid to have them come to my house. They knew, and I know that they knew it. And only once I was called to the KGB on account of Conquest's book.
That's when you told them they couldn't do anything more to you, right?
Oh no, that he mixed up. At that time, I didn't even think that. No, I wasn't. Why? They didn't even threaten me with anything. At that time, they were very polite, but they knew I could refuse even. They called me. They telephoned me and asked me in a very polite manner to come over to the Lubyanka, you know, to the place, if I could come over. And
Drop by.
Yes, I. Before that, I was always thinking that if they summon me, like, I would just say I have nothing. Well, if they want to talk to me, let them come to me. I have nothing. But I decided to go over, and when they started questioning me...
You mustn't fuss with this, otherwise they won't hear you.
I'm sorry. Yes, started questioning me. That was a case they had arrested. They uncovered an organization, well, arrested some people. There were 3 of them, and one of them was one who used to come to my place and get things that he wanted to read, and I gave him that book.
The Conquest book.
Conquest book that they had from Bukowski, and I had it for, it was already 2 or 3 years, and I was very, I valued it very much. It was a beautiful edition, hardcover edition, and so on. And
I hope you look up the author while you're in London.
I would like to. I'd like to very much.
Well, we have an examiner here, a very distinguished editor, who is going to pursue the line of inquiry. He's Mr. Andrew Knight, the editor of The Economist. a graduate of Ampleforth College and of Balliol College in Oxford. So I will now turn the questioning over to Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight.
Mm-hmm.
He's right behind you, so you have to turn just a little bit.
All right.
Mrs. Ulanovskaia.
Yeah. Yes.
You've described very fascinatingly the sort of conversion that you went through.
Terribly unarticulate, I know that.
No, he heard you very well.
Yes, I've heard you very well. The conversion that you went through in 1937, the Great Purges, would you still describe yourself as a revolutionary in spirit? And would you still describe yourself, for example, at one moment you said that although you had never formally been a member of the Communist Party, you were in some respects sometimes more royal than the king,
yes,
more royalist
absolutely.
than the king.
So
Would you still feel that you were in sympathy with communism and with the aims of the revolution?
No, I mean, with socialism, I mean, well, no, I am not a revolutionary anymore. I don't believe that revolution
Accomplishes
anything, just like wars. And I am absolutely, I am against any revolutions in the Soviet Union. I don't want any revolutions there.
What do you want in the Soviet Union? Excuse me, Andrew.
What I want in the Soviet Union, I want them to just go on. I mean, you can't. Well, I just want them to be more be more like any other people. I realize they can't change. There's not much that they can change. I mean, though maybe if they drop the idea of the collectivization, perhaps there may be some peasants that would go back to there, maybe, but I can't give back the factories, and there's nobody to take them over, and maybe so. I don't think capitalism can be and should be revived. I mean,
in other words, you feel yourself an optimist for the long term about the gradual liberalization, as you called it, in the Soviet Union.
Yes, but I would like it to be less gradual and more swifter. And I think I am an optimist if mankind in general survives. I mean,
now at one time for
there is
you,
hope.
the American people and America and the bourgeois capitalism,
Yes.
in your terminology,
Yes,
which
yes.
it represented, was the enemy of progress in the 1930s,
Yes.
in the early 1930s. It was the enemy of progress. With all that you have seen, is it still the enemy of progress in your mind?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think that the capitalist world now, I think the capitalist world has changed so much. And I don't think that even the individual capitalists are more enemies of working class than individual communists are. No,
You
a
see,
lot has changed.
Mrs. Ulanovskaia, in Britain now, my country, and in West Germany, for example, I find people not much younger than me, and some of them much younger, in their teens, going to East Germany and coming back and genuinely preferring that society there, which shocks me terribly. What should I say to them with the experience that you have of having worked against both sides in a way and for both sides? What should I say to them?
Well, some people come to Russia and admire Russia too.
Incredible.
And I know even people who came at Stalin's time and admired it very much. But, well, what can you do? Those are the people that come with the idea of admiring, of finding.
I think that's true.
You see, Well, the only thing I thought of, some of them during the war, I remember an English lady.
Just watch your hands,
Excuse me.
otherwise you get a
Sorry.
static.
An English, she was a correspondent for the Observer at that time, by the way. Is she, well, I think I can, why not, Iris Morley. She was the wife of Ulrich Jacob, who I think is still alive, but I don't mind. She came from the aristocracy. I know that one of her ancestors was well, very high, somewhere around the king, but she was a communist. And, well, all I wished, I couldn't talk to her because she was a communist, and when I he somehow started talk, I always wanted to talk to them, to know, to tell them, but said, what about the pact with Hitler? And she says, why? That was right. Everything was right. Well, all I thought at that time, I wish you to be not a correspondent, a foreigner, having all the privileges and all that, but an ordinary Soviet citizen, that's all. And that's all. Live for like an ordinary Soviet citizen, and I'm sure that you won't be a communist much longer.
There were other members of our aristocracy at the time, of course, one of the Mitford sisters, as you know. I would say that some of those were rather romantic. The sort of people I'm talking about are very intelligent young people, and that's what depresses us. I'd like to ask Mr. Buckley, Mrs. Ulanovskaia at one point talked about the almost universal sympathy in the American liberal intellectual community for the Soviet Union. Now, all this concern about this, I want to address this question to Mr. Buckley. Concern about this peaked in the United States during the early 1950s in Senator McCarthy's time. You are a biographer of Senator McCarthy.
No, an analyst.
An analyst of Senator McCarthy. Would you say that at the time, looking back on it, looking back with the advantage of 20 years, 25 years, that at the time the attacks on the liberal intellectual community in America were overdone for their sympathy?
No, I don't think they were overdone. With all deference to Mrs. Ulanovskaia, I think she overdid it. I don't think there was anything like universal sympathy.
No, I mean,
there was a fascination with the Soviet experiment, which fascination prospered with the Depression.
Yes.
People kept thinking, well, there must be another way, a revolutionary socialist way. But I think that as a percentage, it was very, very few American intellectuals who sympathized.
But those that we met,
well, naturally, you moved in the concentration.
Yes, of
but
course.
I would
understand that.
Using a rough figure, I would say that probably 1 out of 10 or 12 was, in the most attenuated sense of the word, a sympathizer.
But 1 out of 12, in the most attenuated sense of the words.
Yeah.
Did that really justify the attacks on some careers, for example, in the State Department?
Well, it depends
on
whether
some
that was
political
12th.
careers.
It depends whether that was the 12th or one of the other 11.
Do you think that occasionally we've included, those who were attacking those people, included among the included as the 12th people who were in fact members of the 11?
Oh, sure. I don't know of any system in which that doesn't happen, especially when you're talking about people, a part of whose professional responsibility is to trick you. So inevitably, some of them succeed, and inevitably, some of them arouse suspicions who oughtn't to have done so. For instance, you will take, say, the type who was in favor of socialized medicine and didn't care under what rubric he traveled. He would join any organization. I have a man in mind that was again in favor of socialized medicine and ended up joining 15 communist fronts. So inevitably, his name would be linked sometimes with the pro-communist sources, but unfairly.
It amounted, though, didn't it? Nothing on the scale of Stalin. I'm not using the word purge loosely, I hope. But it did amount, in a minor way, compared with Stalin, to a sort of purge, didn't it, in the United States? Which, with all the attendant terror...
No,
in some,
with none of the attendant terror.
Oh, I think so, in some breasts.
I think there were something like 400 people dismissed from the executive arm of government, which employed about 1.5 million.
But how many others feared?
That's
Well, certainly the guilty ones feared. How many of the innocent ones feared is really the relevant question, and I think probably some did. There's a sense in which if I set out to fool you and to devise a movement, the purpose of which is to fool you, you being the government of Great Britain, inevitably, by the practice of duplicity, I make life difficult for other people. And there is a sense in which American fellow travelers made it hard for genuine idealists precisely by victimizing them. The people who were the principal victimizers were the communists and the conscious fellow travelers, because their business was to take innocent people and bring them into their camp, causing difficulties at a future time.
It's a quarter of a century ago now, and we're in the presence of a very gentle and perspicacious lady whose memory goes back to really the heyday, 50 years ago. Do you think, in retrospect, Mr. Buckley, that that there are any people that you pilloried at the time who you regret, in retrospect, having pilloried?
Well, I never pilloried anybody that I regret pillorying. I listed a person as probably a security risk, who I am now convinced was not. But I am convinced that at the time I did so, I was using an objective intelligence. His name, by the way, was John Peyton Davies. But the only man I could have been said to have pilloried was Owen Lattimore, and I continue to believe, as a committee of 13 senators, 7 of them Democrats, unanimously concluded, that he was a conscious, articulate instrument of the Soviet conspiracy, who finally found a very hospitable home at the University of Leeds.
Can I ask...
I'm afraid, let me see now.
Your guest one final question, and that is, I think we have 1 minute, I'm told. You're now in Israel, Mrs. Ulanovskaia.
Yes.
Do you like your adopted country?
Yes, I do. Well, my adopted country has many faults, many drawbacks, but still I think, since I left the Soviet Union, the only place for me is Israel. Well, and with all drawbacks and all the faults, I wouldn't live in any other country. I wouldn't like to live there. I think that's the place for all of the Jews that come from the Soviet Union. Well, not for all of them, but it's all right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knight, and thank you very much, Mrs. Nadia Ulanovskaia, and I hope you enjoy your visit in Great Britain.
Very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding was provided by this station and by other public television stations.